You are lying in the dark now, letting your thoughts drift. And as you sink deeper into stillness, we travel quietly backward, 7 centuries to the worn wooden floors and incense-thick air of a brothel in Yuan Dynasty, China. The year is 1321. The city, Dadu, now known as Beijing. Outside, the empire stretches endlessly. Roads built by conquered hands, walls patrolled by horsemen descended from Genghis Khan, and beyond it all, the slow pulse of commerce and class. The Mongols rule now, but China is vast, and beneath the banners of emperors and the scrolls of scholars, life is made and unmade in the ordinary. In bowls of rice, in marriages of convenience, and in the faint scratch of ink marking contracts no one remembers. Tonight, we remember 5 women, whose names, if they were ever written down, have long since crumbled to dust. These women were not emperors, not warriors, not poets. They were prostitutes. You see, in Yuan China, the profession was both condemned and taxed. A strange mixture of disdain and bureaucratic interest defined their status. They were called ji, though the term's meaning wavered over the centuries, from courtesan to mere servant of pleasure. In official records, these women appeared occasionally, a tax document here, a legal case there, always background figures to someone else's story. But what if we placed them at the center? What if we, for once, allowed boredom itself, the administrative details, the forgotten rhythms of their lives, to speak? The registry book of Dadu. Our first woman, we'll call her Mei Lian, though her real name is unknown, appears only once in historical documentation. A ledger from Dadu's brothel tax office in the district near the drum tower. These ledgers were dry, careful things. They recorded how many women worked at a given establishment, what they were charged in monthly grain, and whether the brothel was in good standing with the state. Mei Lian was 23. The record noted she had 2 teeth missing and singing voice diminished. It was likely her final year at the brothel. There was no pension, no farewell gift, just a drop in income for Madame Chu, who managed the house. You might wonder why a woman like Mei Lian would end up in a brothel. The answer, as always in history, is many-layered and dull. Famine in her village, a father in debt, a marriage promise broken. Some women were sold by family, others arrived willingly, believing stories of silk gowns and literate patrons. In truth, Mei Lian's life was a repetition of tasks. She woke early to fetch water from the community well. She prepared tea for the guests before they arrived, mixed with mint in the summer, chrysanthemum in the winter. Her feet were unbound, a detail that made her less desirable to Han elites, but better able to carry heavy jugs without falling. Evenings were spent entertaining, rarely in the erotic sense we now assume. Most clients were bored officials or lonely traders. She recited Tang poetry, mostly poorly memorized lines, though occasionally she hit the rhythm just right. Her specialty was a drinking song attributed to Bai Juyi.
But perhaps the most interesting part of Mei Lian's record isn't the note about her voice, it's the additional annotation. Petitions for release denied. Appeal copied to provincial archive. She tried to leave. In Yuan, China, some prostitutes could buy their freedom if they had the coin, or if a benefactor paid for their release. Mei Lian had neither. Still, she tried. That attempt, that small act of resistance, earned her half a line in the ledger and an echo into our story. The clothes dyer's companion. The second woman, whom we'll call Shu, lived in Luoyang, hundreds of miles southwest. Her name appears in a court record involving a murder, not hers, but that of a man named Deng Shiwen, a clothes dyer who frequented her apartment. The record, written in careful legalese, states that Deng was found with a jar of indigo overturned and a female companion present but not charged. Shu was not named as a prostitute in the case, merely as a woman of shared quarters. But a side note from the magistrate confirms she was under brothel contract. Shu's story is stitched together from bureaucratic scraps. She worked under Madame An, whose brothel catered to laborers. These were rough places, with thin walls and weaker tea. There were no musicians. Instead, women were taught to banter, to laugh at jokes, to massage calloused feet and aching backs. Shu had a missing finger, perhaps an old accident, perhaps punishment. We do not know. But Deng Shiwen kept visiting her 3 nights a week, even bringing her rice during a poor harvest. When he died, Shu was found weeping, but silent. She did not defend herself. She did not need to. The court believed her story, such as it was. The murderer was someone else, a jealous debtor. After the trial, the court ordered the brothel to be inspected for unlicensed debt collection, and Shu disappeared from all records. We can guess what happened. She was likely sold to another brothel further inland, where her story dissolved into the usual cycle: teacups, incense, empty rooms. Of tacks and teeth, the daily business of being bought. The third woman had a different fate, or at least a different kind of paperwork. Her record is preserved in a tax scroll from Hangzhou, then still a wealthy city of rivers and bridges. The scroll, now stored at the Zhejiang Provincial Archive, lists serving women of commerce zones, among which one is described with odd precision. Aged 31, gold tooth, reads basic Buddhist scripture, no surviving family. Her name might have been Ansu, though the writing is damaged. What's notable is that she was considered unusually literate for her profession. She could read the Heart Sutra aloud, and was reportedly called upon to chant at funerals when no monk could be found in time. In this way, she earned tips not just from men, but from grieving widows. Ansu represents a type of woman often forgotten, even among forgotten prostitutes, the aging service worker who survives by diversifying. She was not pretty, not musical, but she could read. That skill, borrowed from an older brother maybe, or a village monk,
extended her value well beyond the usual age of retirement.
What becomes of a woman like Ansu after 35? The ledgers do not say, but her name disappears a year after her entry. Not sold, not dead, just faded. Bureaucratic sighs and the forgotten few. The fourth woman, perhaps the most boring of them all, appears only in a letter. It was a complaint filed by a merchant's wife in Nanjing, accusing her husband of frequenting the house of perfumed sickness near the fish market. The letter included a list of expenses, receipts, and a sketch of a woman wearing a lotus flower pin. That woman, referred to only as Yu Ying, was the subject of ridicule in the wife's diatribe, blaming the husbands for fiscal laziness and nightly absence. This was not a legal matter, just a marital one. But the pin described, a cheap copper ornament with red lacquer, matches one found in a dig near the docks of Nanjing, buried beside a collapsed structure believed to be an old brothel. Yu Ying never had a record of her own. She exists only in complaint, only in disapproval. Yet we remember her here, if only as a person who wore a pin, was loved by one man and hated by another woman, and once stood by the water where the river met the city's rotting wharves. A question without names. And the fifth woman? She may never have existed, or perhaps she is all of them. She is the woman whose sandal was found in the ruins of a Tang-era wine shop, the woman mentioned in a traveler's song about lonely nights near Kaifeng, the one whose bones, buried with a scrap of silk, were labeled simply female adult, aged 25 to 30. Why do we remember emperors but not them? Why do we repeat the stories of kings and ignore those who lived among sweat, incense, millet, and sadness? What do we owe the forgotten? And in a world where no one becomes famous, is surviving itself a kind of rebellion?
You are still lying there, and the room is quiet save for your breathing. You haven't moved much. Maybe your fingers twitch once or twice as your body begins to loosen from the day's burdens. History, too, continues in stillness. And so we return to the fading corners of the Yuan dynasty, right where we left off, with the women who were written out of history, one receipt, one broken teacup at a time. Let's travel again, through the alleys of Dadu, the canals of Hangzhou, and into the inner rooms of an empire whose beauty masked the banality of its record-keeping. In this section, we look not at names or glimpses, but at the very system that bound these women to their labor. The tools of survival were ink, taxes, silence, and the geography of a city that never quite cared whether you lived or died. This is not a tale of rescue. No princes came for them. They survived anyway. The Contract Scrolls of Madame Chu. In the archive vaults of the National Library of China, there is a battered roll of bamboo strips known as the Chu Account Scroll. It was discovered in the 1940s during a construction project
preserved in the sealed foundation of a Yuan-era tea house. Most of it is dull, purely financial, but if you take time with it, as a sleepy historian might, you begin to see the outline of lives. The scroll belonged to Madame Q, a brothel keeper in Da-Du between 1317 and 1335. Her house was mid-sized, not a low-end tavern, not a noble's pleasure garden, just a standard establishment registered with the Office of Urban Morality. Her scroll shows 23 women under her management. Next to each name is a series of numbers, debts, monthly upkeep, fees for clothing, and recovery charges, which were penalties paid when a girl became ill or unfit for work. This is where we find Mei Lian again. Her debts were listed as 4 taels of silver and 8 jiao, mostly from entry fees, bedding, and an advance paid to her family 3 years prior. She had repaid only 1.3 taels in her entire time there. Her voice was noted as impaired, and her clothing expenses were unusually low. She hadn't received new robes in over a year. The implication, her clients had dried up. A brothel girl's contract was never simple. While the law technically allowed self-purchase, buying one's freedom, nearly all contracts were structured so that escape was mathematically impossible. Charges were inflated, earnings manipulated, and the threat of being sold to a rougher district hung like smoke in the air. The scroll included a single note beside Mei Lian's name: to be relocated to Gansu if unproductive by next season. Gansu was far west, a harsh place with fewer customers and colder nights, fewer survivors.
She never made it to Gansu. Her name disappears from the scroll the next year. Whether she died or escaped, we'll never know. But the scroll tells us everything we need. In Yuan China, survival often hinged on arithmetic. Rooms behind doors, the architecture of brothels. The places these women lived in were not temples of luxury. Their walls were thin, their smells were thick. Incense, sweat, fried oil, mold. Brothels were often built on top of shops, with a tavern or bathhouse in front and a hidden courtyard behind. The better ones had separate rooms. The worse ones offered curtains. The floor plans followed patterns imposed by city ordinances, especially after a 1309 fire destroyed 37 buildings in the licensed pleasure quarter of Da-Du. After that, all brothels were required to have water buckets at every entry and tiled roofs to reduce fire hazards. This might sound like a detail too dull to matter, but remember, survival meant not being burned in your sleep. In these buildings, women slept during the day and worked at night. They shared wash basins. There was usually one comb for every 3 or 4 girls. Hair oil was communal. If one girl had lice, they all did. Food was standard and uninspired: steamed millet, sour cabbage, and dried tofu. Once a week, the madam might allow pork or duck, more for morale than nutrition. One scroll from Hangzhou notes a celebration stew served on the emperor's birthday, consisting of offal, ginger, and wine. It was the only hot meal of that month. Yet some brothels created strange islands of comfort. Ansu, the scripture reader from Section 1, reportedly kept a miniature garden in a bowl. tiny mosses and a shard of jade. It wasn't decorative. It was something to care for. When everything is taken from you, even moss can feel like ownership. Nighttime routines, rituals of the profession. Each night began with preparation. The girls painted their lips with crushed flower petals or lamp soot mixed with oil. Eyebrows were plucked into thin arcs. They practiced smiles in mirrors made of polished bronze. Their robes were recycled silks, usually dyed to hide stains, and held together with careful pinning. Once dressed, they sat in the greeting room, legs tucked beneath them, waiting for clients. Each man who walked in was greeted with tea, flattery, and options. A typical conversation went like this. "Honored sir, you've had a long journey. Would you prefer poetry or song tonight?" If the man was drunk or poor, there was less performance. If he was wealthy, the act might last hours. Drinking, calligraphy contests, sad stories about his wife. Some men cried. Some asked to be told they were handsome. Some simply wanted to sleep next to someone who would not rob them. You'd be surprised how often the work had little to do with sex. In the middle-tier brothels, it was common for girls to specialize. Some were better at card games. Some were skilled in the 4 arts: keen playing, chess, calligraphy, and painting. But most, like Xu in Luyang, were there because of need, not talent.
If a girl became favored by a regular, she might receive gifts, hairpins, soap, even extra food. These tiny luxuries were traded like currency. A decent bar of soap could buy a night off. A silver ring might earn protection from the madam's wrath. Small economies, but real. Diseases, disappearances, and the unwritten deaths. Prostitution, like so many ancient professions, carried quiet violence. Not always from clients, though that happened too, but from the wear and tear of long nights, poor hygiene, and untreated illness. Yueying, the one remembered only through a complaint by a merchant's wife, may have suffered from the same fate as many: plague fatigue. That was the phrase scrawled in a brothel inspection record in Nanjing in 1324. The city had seen a mild outbreak of what was likely pneumonic plague, and the inspector wrote that at least 17 girls were taken by black cough this season. The brothel was shut down for 3 weeks. No compensation was offered to the families, if any existed. Girls who became too sick were often removed before they could infect others. Some were sent to resting houses on the city's outskirts, often little more than death waiting rooms. Others simply disappeared. One madam wrote in her ledger, "Yun gone to ancestors, bedding burned." That was the entire obituary, gone to ancestors. It is estimated that less than 10% of Yuan-era prostitutes lived to age 40. Most didn't reach 30. Escape? Occasionally, a girl did escape, not by running into the night. That usually ended in recapture or worse, but by quietly earning the favor of someone powerful enough to release her. The law required a signed release document, an accounting of all debts, and a formal letter of departure witnessed by 2 male officials. These documents were rare, but a handful survive. One such letter from 1330 records the release of a woman named Chengli, aged 29, skilled in calligraphy and needlework, who was bought out by a Buddhist merchant. The release included 8 taels of silver, payment of all debts, and an additional silence fee to the madam, likely to prevent gossip.
What happened to Cheng Li afterward is unknown, but for one moment her name was inked clearly, attached not to debt, but to freedom. A world that didn't look twice. In the end, the system functioned smoothly. Women came, worked, and disappeared. The government taxed the madams. The madams loaned out robes. Clients wrote poetry. Everything stayed quiet. And yet, behind the numbers, the quiet resistance of survival persisted. A girl who learned to fake a cough to avoid work. Another who gave away rice to a sick friend. One who etched a name onto the inside of a teacup, hoping someone would remember it. These women were not revolutionaries. They weren't saints. They were tired. They were clever. They were alive. You can almost hear them if you listen long enough. A laugh behind a curtain. A voice reciting poetry in the wrong meter. A breath drawn before pretending to smile. And in the end, the brothels were torn down. The scrolls forgotten. The bodies buried. But the moss in Ansu's bowl may have outlived her. And so we ask, in an empire that remembered walls, taxes, and wars, but not women, is survival through invisibility a kind of legacy?
Fading ink, vanishing names, and the long sleep of history. The city is quieter now. Night falls slowly in Yuan, China. You can almost hear the clink of teacups being washed, the faint rustle of straw mats being unrolled for sleep, and somewhere out of view, the soft lull of a reed flute, played not for an audience, but perhaps just for company. As you rest deeper into the folds of history, we arrive at the final part of this first story. One where the records end, but the questions begin. We've spoken of contracts, of tea rituals, of tired women surviving by the threadbare math of someone else's balance sheet. But now we ask, what becomes of someone who is never remembered? A death without ceremony. Our story resumes in 1333 in the city of Dadu. The brothel owned by Madame Q had changed hands. She had died, of what no one recorded. Her girls were divided up and sent to other houses like livestock. A common practice, it was cheaper than acquiring new women, and officials took their cut of the transaction. One of the girls listed in this final transition record is marked simply Old Mei Lian, last duty, kitchen support. She was not working with clients anymore. Her duties now involved boiling water, folding bedding, feeding the courtyard cats, and handling the refuse. In brothel terminology, this role was sometimes given mock respect, matron in service, but in reality, it meant she was too old or unwell to earn money from clients. She likely died within that year. There was no funeral. Women like Mei Lian were wrapped in matting or thin cloth and buried in unofficial cemeteries near market ditches or along the outskirts of the city. Some bodies were thrown into shared pits, many not even noted in death registers. And yet, one story survived. A man with a letter. Decades after the Yuan fell and the Ming dynasty rose, a local magistrate in Shanxi province wrote about a curious document found in the belongings of an elderly postal clerk. It was a letter, undelivered and incomplete, possibly a draft. It was addressed only as, "To my brother in Liaodong."
In it, the writer, who signs only as M, speaks of life in Dadu, of being bought but not broken, and of hoping that one day you'll come find me, even if I am no longer beautiful. She says, I do not blame father, I do not even blame fortune. But if you ever smell jasmine, think of me. I wore it in my hair even when I could afford nothing else. Could this have been Mei Lian? The timeline fits, the location fits, and above all, the tone fits. A woman who never asked to be famous, who never wanted a monument, just a brother to remember her name. Love in the narrow alleys of Luoyang. Let's move now to Xu, the woman found in court records after a client of hers, Deng Shiwen, was murdered in her presence. After the case was resolved and she was sent to another district, her name vanishes from formal record. But a poem survives. It is part of a minor anthology by an anonymous author titled 10 Nights in Luoyang. One of the poems, dated to the year following Deng's death, reads, She wore no pearls, only dusk on her skin, and spoke little lest the silence flee. I asked for a song. She offered tea. Poetry in this era was often written in code, emotional memories preserved in abstract gestures. But scholars believe this woman may have been Xu. The poem continues, I asked why she did not leave. She said the birds leave. I am not a bird. There is no great romance here, no rescue, no escape. But someone remembered her, not for her body, not even for her sadness, but for her quiet, her tea, her refusal to lie. What dignity exists in being seen, even once, for who you truly are.
Silk and Sutra, the unrecorded end of Ansu. Ansu, the older prostitute in Hangzhou who read Buddhist scriptures and maintained a moss garden, is believed to have died in 1331 during the Yellow River floods. Many people did. The event was devastating, washing away entire districts and taking with it records, belongings, lives. An archaeological excavation in 2009 uncovered a cluster of homes believed to have belonged to working-class courtesans in the Southern Bank district. Among the items recovered was a flat shard of jade carved into the shape of a small leaf, nearly identical to a reference in an old provincial note. Garden of Ansu contains one jade leaf, watered daily. Whether this was hers or merely similar, it suggests she lived her days with intention. Where so many saw brothels as sites of shame, she carved a life, not for grandeur, not for legacy, just for meaning. A woman reading Buddhist scriptures to sick clients and watching moss grow in a teacup may sound like a metaphor, but in Yuan China, it was a strategy for staying sane, a ritual of stillness amid noise. Yuying and the iron law of memory. Of all the 5 women, Yuying is the least known, mentioned only in a complaint by a merchant's wife, remembered for a copper lotus pen, and connected to a collapsed building near the Nanjing docks. That's it. That's all. Her memory is indirect, a side character in someone else's outrage. No document ever places her in a personal context. No letter, no poem, no ledger. She is not seen. She is referred to. So why include her? Because for every Mei Lian or Ansu with a traceable story, there are 1,000 Yuyings, reduced to rumors, pin styles, and shadows on walls. And these shadows remind us that history is not made of emperors. It's made of forgotten choices, quiet resistances, and lives that happened just outside the frame. The merchant's wife who hated Yuying probably had her own story. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe her husband was cruel. Maybe the lotus pin reminded her of who she used to be before marriage. History rarely answers those questions. It merely notes them, scribbled on the margins. The long sleep of the undocumented. As the Yuan dynasty crumbled under rebellion and economic collapse, the registered brothels suffered too. Tax offices burned, ledger scrolls turned to ash. The girls who were moved, traded, sold, many were never recorded again, and so they became anonymous once more. When Ming officials reconstructed the cities, they found burned bedposts, melted teapots, and combs buried in the rubble. In one ruined pleasure house near the Grand Canal, an inscription was found carved into a wooden beam. "Do not remember me, but remember the song." It was unsigned. Perhaps it was left by one of these women, or by someone like them. A woman who knew that fame was for poets, generals, and murderers, that history would not honor her. But songs linger. They slip through centuries. What it all meant, if anything. So what did these women leave behind? Not legacies, not children in most cases, not epics. They left taxes unpaid, contracts faded, scraps of song, a moss bowl, a copper pin. They lived lives that were transactional, constrained, often degrading. But they also laughed. They helped one another survive. They sometimes loved. They prayed. They tried to run or tried to stay. They did what everyone does. They lived with what they were given. And in the end, they didn't become famous. They didn't write books. They didn't change dynasties. But maybe that's the point. Most people don't. As you lie here, the air around you still, and your eyes beginning to feel heavy, perhaps this is the best time to ask, why do we remember emperors who destroyed cities, but not women who survived them? Why are the names carved in stone always louder than the ones whispered over shared bowls of soup in the dark? Maybe the question isn't, what did they achieve? Maybe the better question is, how many of us, if we were erased from every official record, would still deserve to be remembered anyway?
Story 2. The Man Who Swept the Emperor's Floors. A janitor of the Forbidden City. The room around you is dim. Your body sinks into stillness, and your breathing slows as you drift into a time not marked by urgency, but by routine. A time where history was built not on victories or declarations, but on mops, buckets, and the sound of soft steps on polished stone. Welcome to the heart of Ming Dynasty China. The year is 1527. We are not here to speak of emperors, eunuchs, or generals. Not directly, anyway. Instead, we begin with the broom. More specifically, the man who held it. A city of silence and ceremony. At the heart of Beijing stands the Forbidden City, the imperial palace complex surrounded by high red walls and a moat wide enough to swallow whole villages. It was a place of immense symmetry, hierarchy, and isolation. A city where every inch was designed with purpose, and every person within it was placed there by decree. Its courtyards were vast, its gates lined with dragon motifs, and its rooftops glittered with yellow glazed tiles reserved only for the Son of Heaven. Every surface mattered. Every corner had to shine. Which brings us to Chen Shu. Born in the province of Hebei, the son of a tile worker and a washerwoman, his name never appeared in royal edicts. No poet ever praised his labor. But for more than 30 years, he was one of the men tasked with sweeping the imperial floors. More specifically, the eastern corridor of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. That was all. That was everything. The path to dust. Chen Shu was 14 when he first entered the Forbidden City. He had no connections, no letters of introduction, but after a famine struck his village in the winter of 1512, his father sent him to the capital to find rice or become it. The phrase meant find work or starve. After weeks of living near the market district and doing odd jobs, washing horses, carrying tiles, he was selected during a hiring round for palace maintenance laborers. This was not a coveted position. It was low status, strictly regulated, and came with no promise of promotion. But it paid enough for 2 bowls of rice per day, and it offered shelter. Chen signed a contract marked with a thumbprint in black ink. It gave him the right to sleep in the East servants' quarters and the duty to report at dawn to his assigned supervisor, Supervisor Ming Li, who oversaw sanitation for the eastern quarter of the palace. Chen's first task was simple: sweep the steps outside the gate of heavenly purity. These steps were made of carved white marble and had to be swept before sunrise every day, no exceptions, not even during rain, not even during mourning periods. In winter, this meant chipping ice with a wooden scraper. In summer, it meant brushing away the dust kicked up by officials' robes. And for this, he was paid in steamed buns, boiled greens, and occasionally, if no one was watching, a spoonful of sweet bean paste. Routine as rule. By the time Chen was 20, he had memorized the rhythm of the palace. 4 a.m., awake. 4:30 a.m., water the stone courtyards. 5 a.m., sweep East corridor. 6 a.m., mop steps, wring cloths, polish bronze incense holders. 7 a.m., retreat to Servants' Bay to avoid being seen by higher officials. 8 a.m. through 3 p.m., stay alert for summons, emergencies, or accidents. No deviation was permitted. A misplaced bucket could result in a beating. A missed crack in the tile could mean demotion or expulsion. Chen learned to be invisible, precise, and silent. His tools were basic. One long-handled broom made of bundled reeds, a bronze basin used for mopping, a cotton cloth for polishing lacquer, and over time, a habit of counting steps to keep his mind occupied. He counted everything. 12 tiles between the dragon pillars, 62 cracks in the southeast corridor. 11 drops of oil were needed to shine the bronze lion. He did this for years, not because anyone asked, but because it gave him a sense of place in a world that never said his name. The man who cleaned the dust of history. Chen witnessed many things he was not allowed to speak of. He saw eunuchs arguing over concubines. He saw a young prince weeping into his sleeve during a thunderstorm. He saw an official collapse during summer court from heat exhaustion, and later, the quiet removal of his body. Most importantly, he saw what was left behind. For example, when Emperor Jijing, known for his obsession with Taoist rituals, moved a prayer altar from one hall to another, Chen was part of the crew tasked with scrubbing the now empty floor. There, beneath the altar, he found dozens of folded scraps of yellow paper, each with burned incense stains and written prayers. He didn't read them aloud. He didn't take them, but he remembered the handwriting. Delicate, thin, and barely inked, like the person who wrote them wanted the gods to strain to listen. Later that night, as Chen ate his meal in silence, he asked no one in particular. If the emperor's prayers fall to dust like mine, do we all kneel to the same silence? No one answered. He went back to sweeping. In the shadow of the Son of Heaven. Chen Shu never saw the emperor up close. That privilege belonged only to high-ranking eunuchs, ministers, and palace women in inner service. But he saw the aftermath of imperial presence. After an imperial procession, Chen would help wipe the prince from the carved railings. After a festival, he would sweep up flower petals and bits of broken jade that had been part of the ceremony. Once, he even found a fallen hairpin, gold with a carved phoenix, behind a pillar. He reported it, of course. Keeping lost items was theft. Still, he held it for a moment, just long enough to feel the chill of the metal and wonder whose hair it had graced. He never asked questions, but he noticed the difference between the boots of a general and the slippers of a concubine, the faint traces of perfume that lingered after a ceremony, the places where even royalty sometimes forgot to clean up. He understood, in his quiet way, that even the palace had flaws. Even the dragon throne collected dust. At 42, Chen's knees began to fail. The endless crouching and scrubbing had worn out the cartilage, and during the wet season, he limped slightly. His supervisor noted it in the work report. Mobility limited. Assign light duty. Chen was transferred to inner gate duty. sweeping the shaded walkways near the Hall of Mental Cultivation. These halls were quieter, visited mostly by scholars and the emperor's personal staff. He swept slowly now, leaning on a bamboo cane he'd cut himself from a stalk outside the southern wall. He spoke even less than before. One day, while scrubbing an alcove near the garden pond, he paused and looked into the still water. There, reflected with strange clarity, was the edge of the golden roof. For a moment, the water shimmered like gold. Then, a falling leaf disturbed it. Qin did not write poetry. He did not recite philosophy, but he did mutter to himself, "Even the emperor's house reflects best when still." That would have made a good proverb, but no one heard it. Where the record fails. We know Qin existed only because of a secondary entry in the Ming Work Roster Records, Volume 4, compiled in 1546. A brief note states, Qin Shu, Janitorial Division, deceased. Honorable conduct, 30 years service. No surviving kin. Interred beneath Servant Grove. That was it. No mention of his thoughts. No recounting of his days. No record of what he saw, what he remembered, or what he regretted. He left no family, no children, no personal writings, just a broom, a cane, and 30 years of walking the same tiled path each morning. But what if we could hear his voice? What would he say about the empire? About the weight of silence? About the satisfaction of a clean floor? Would he speak with bitterness or peace? Or would he simply say, "I kept the dragon's halls clean"? That was enough. Whispers beneath the red roofs. The next morning, Shen De returned to the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The golden tiles sparkled in the early sun, and the air held the scent of incense and morning dew. He walked slowly, broom in hand, every step soft, as if he were afraid to wake the ghosts of the palace. The forbidden city was alive in a strange way. It did not speak, but it whispered. The cold wind, sliding through wooden beams, carried voices from the past. Shen De sometimes paused, closing his eyes, as if listening. But these were not ghosts. They were memories, some his own, some belonging to the palace itself. The hidden beauty of the Forbidden City. Though he was only a janitor, Shen De had access to places no ordinary man ever saw. Behind the giant gates, past the bronze lions and tall red walls, he wandered alone during hours of silence. He had memorized every crack in the stone path, every pattern on the carved dragons, and every faded painting above the doors. He knew where the snow melted first and where the moonlight shone brightest at night. There was one garden he especially loved, the Garden of Tranquil Harmony. It was a place where time slowed down. In spring, cherry blossoms fell like soft pink rain. In autumn, golden leaves danced through the air. Shende often stopped here after his cleaning duties, not because it was part of his work, but because the garden reminded him of peace, of a life before the palace, of a simpler time long gone, a past buried in dust. Years ago, Shende had a different name, a different purpose. He once dreamed to becoming a scholar, perhaps even serving the emperor with wisdom and advice. But life in ancient China was never easy for a poor farmer's son. When his father died during a harsh winter, Shende sold his books and left his village. The Forbidden City offered no golden welcome. He begged for months outside its gates before someone gave him a broom and pointed toward the rear halls. Clean. Don't speak. Don't look the wrong way, they warned. But Shende had a gift. He watched without being seen. He listened without being heard. And slowly he learned things about the people inside these red walls, about their habits, about their fears. He never shared what he knew. That's why they trusted him. Because he was quiet, because he was nobody. But he remembered everything. The Emperor's Shadow. One day, as Shendi was cleaning the floor near the side entrance of the Hall of Mental Cultivation, something strange happened. He heard footsteps, light, careful ones. Not the heavy boots of soldiers or the wooden sandals of servants. These were softer. He turned slightly and saw a young man in a plain robe, too plain for someone allowed in this part of the palace. Their eyes met. For a second, Shendi wanted to bow, but the young man shook his head. "You didn't see me," he whispered. And then he disappeared through the shadows of the corridor. That was not the first time Shendi saw him. Over the next few weeks, the young man appeared again and again, always near hidden doors or quiet gardens. Once, Shendi saw him near the secret library. Another time, he spotted him near the Empress's private courtyard. He never asked who he was, but one day an old guard whispered, "That boy, he's the Emperor's half-brother, a secret they kept from the world, born from a concubine they tried to hide." Shendi never spoke of it, but it stayed with him like a secret wound. He knew too much, and in the Forbidden City, knowing too much could be dangerous. The language of silence. Being a janitor was more than sweeping floors. It was reading the signs of life. Shendi learned to understand the meaning behind certain things. A wet footprint on a dry floor, a dropped jade hairpin, a half-burnt letter in a fire bin. One morning, he found a folded fan tucked behind a column. It was expensive, made of silk with golden thread. He opened it gently. On it was written a poem. Even the stars cannot shine through walls so high, yet my heart escapes each night to fly. He didn't know who had written it, but the sadness in those lines made him stop his work and sit on the cold floor for a long time. He began to notice more signs. A servant girl crying behind a screen. A eunuch limping with a wound he tried to hide. A scholar tossing a secret letter into a pond. The palace looked perfect from the outside, but inside, it was a world of hidden pain, lost dreams, and quiet desperation. And Shendi saw it all.
The Emperor's arrival. One chilly afternoon, the Emperor returned from a journey to the southern provinces. There was excitement in the air. Trumpets sounded, banners waved, servants ran everywhere. Shende was told to clean the entrance hall before the Emperor passed through. As he swept the steps, he noticed something strange. A crack in one of the stone dragons. It was new, perhaps a sign of age, or maybe caused by a soldier's careless boot. But the stone dragon was sacred. It symbolized the power of the Emperor. A crack was not just a break in stone. It was a break in fortune. Shende gently swept the dust into the crack, hiding it from view. He did not want the Emperor to see it and take it as a bad omen. As the golden carriage rolled in, Shende bowed low, head to the ground. He did not look up, but the Emperor stopped. His voice was calm but sharp. "You, what's your name?" Shende froze. No emperor had ever spoken to him. "I am no one, Your Majesty, just a servant." The Emperor walked closer. "No one? Yet your broom touches the same floors I walk upon." Shende raised his head slowly. The Emperor's eyes were dark and sharp, but not unkind. "Do you enjoy your work?" "I do, Majesty, because even dust teaches me something." The Emperor nodded slowly. "Interesting. Carry on." And just like that, he was gone. Shende's heart beat fast. He knew he had just stepped into a circle most men never even saw. A message in the dust. That night, Shende sat in the small quarters he shared with 2 other cleaners. They were already asleep, snoring softly. But he could not sleep. The words of the emperor echoed in his mind. Even your broom touches the same floors I walk upon. Was it a simple comment or something more? Suddenly, he remembered the crack in the stone dragon. He got up and walked back to the hall, broom in hand. The palace was dark and quiet. The torches flickered like sleepy eyes. He walked carefully past sleeping guards and closed doors until he reached the steps again. There, beside the crack, he found something new. A scroll, tied with a red string. He opened it with trembling hands. It was a message, but not written to him. It was a poem, a reply to the fan he had found earlier. Though the sky remains far and walls remain high, my thoughts find yours beneath the silent sky. It was unsigned, but he understood now. The palace had lovers who could not meet, friends who could not speak, and prisoners who wore crowns. And somehow, the janitor had become their secret witness.
Secrets behind the golden walls. The sun was still low in the sky when Shen Day entered the Hall of Supreme Harmony. His broom touched the polished floor in slow, respectful movements. As he swept, his mind was filled with the emperor's words from the previous night. Watch closely, Shen Day. What you see is not always what is. He hadn't slept at all. Behind those red walls and golden dragons, something was stirring. Something dangerous. Shen Day had spent more than 2 decades inside the Forbidden City, yet this was the first time he felt that every whisper could carry a blade. As he swept behind a tall pillar, he heard voices. Quiet, careful. 2 men were speaking in the garden beyond the open window. Shen Day froze. The boy doesn't know who he is, said one voice, low and cautious. And he must never find out, said another, sharper one. If the emperor falls ill again, the court will need direction. We'll say the boy has been adopted, a poor orphan raised by the emperor out of pity, nothing more. Shen Day's heart thudded in his chest. The boy? A secret? Was this about the young page Ren Yu? The boy with royal eyes. Shen Day remembered the boy well. Ren Yu was no ordinary page. He appeared 3 years ago when he was only 10 years old. The Empress herself had taken him into the palace as a charity, it was said. But everyone knew the Emperor had been involved in the decision. The child was quiet, graceful, and respectful. His movements were sharp like a trained noble. He had the same steady stare as the emperor, calm, unreadable, powerful. At first, Shen Day thought it was just coincidence, but over the years he noticed small things. The emperor's eyes softened when he saw Ren Yu. The empress always made sure the boy was safe even when she ignored other pages. And now whispers spoke of the boy's true bloodline, the emperor's own son, hidden from the world.
Tea and trust. Later that evening, the emperor called Shen Day again, this time not in a grand hall, but in a quiet room with only a teapot and 2 cushions. "Sit, Shen Day," said the emperor, pouring tea. Shen Day bowed, but hesitated. "Your Majesty, I am only a janitor. This honor—" "Shen Day," the emperor interrupted softly, "do you think I have survived all these years because I trust only ministers and generals?" Shen Day slowly sat. The emperor looked tired. His face showed years of burden, but his eyes still shone with fire. "You have swept the floors of my palace longer than most ministers have held their seats," he said. "You know every sound, every smell, every breath, and most importantly, you know how to stay silent." Shen Day nodded, unsure of what to say. "I need someone like that now, someone who watches without speaking and listens without judgment. I will ask you only one question tonight, and your answer must be true." Shen Day sat straighter. The emperor leaned forward. "Do you believe I should name Ren Yu as my heir?" The weight of a kingdom. The question struck Shen Day like a storm. Name the boy heir? It meant war in the court. It meant betrayal, blood, and broken alliances. Many ministers had waited for years to place their own sons as princes. A hidden heir, especially one raised in secret, would be seen as a threat to everything they had planned. But Shen Day saw the boy. He had seen him run in the gardens when no one was watching. He had seen the way the boy listened during ceremonies, his hands quietly copying the emperor's every gesture. And he remembered a day when Ren Yu helped a servant girl who dropped a basket of fruit. No prince in training would normally bend to help a servant, but Ren Yu had. He had heart. "Your Majesty," Shen Day said finally, "I do not know the politics of courts. I only know what I've seen. The boy carries your blood and your mercy. The rest only heaven can decide." The emperor closed his eyes. For a moment, Shen Day thought he looked more at peace than ever before. The storm arrives. 2 weeks passed. The forbidden city grew tense.
whispers grew louder. Some ministers avoided the emperor's gaze. Others sent gifts and letters to powerful generals. There were rumors of betrayal, even assassination. Shen De kept sweeping, but now he swept with his eyes wide open. One morning, as snow fell quietly outside the palace walls, Shen De entered the hall of mental cultivation. He found the emperor collapsed beside his writing desk. Shen De shouted. Guards rushed in. The imperial physician arrived within minutes. "It's the heart," the physician whispered. "His Majesty needs rest." But rest was impossible. The ministers demanded an audience. The court needed a name, a successor. That evening, the empress summoned Shen De privately. She said, "You are the emperor's trusted eyes. Now, I ask you to become his voice." Shen De was confused. "He left a sealed letter," she explained. "One only to be opened if he could not speak again. He named his successor." Shen De took the letter with trembling hands. On the cover, the emperor's handwriting read, "To my most faithful listener, Shen De." A voice in the hall of thunder. The next morning, snow covered the palace roofs like a white curtain of silence. In the grand hall of thunder, the most powerful men in China gathered. Generals, ministers, governors. The emperor lay in his chamber, too weak to speak. Shen De entered the hall, not with a broom, but with the letter in his hand. Gasps echoed through the room. What is a janitor doing here? This is madness. But the empress stepped forward. His Majesty named Shen De as his trusted speaker. Let him speak. Shen De bowed deeply and opened the scroll. He read slowly, carefully, each word like the strike of a bell. "To those who would lead this land after me, I leave not power, but the duty to protect it. I name as heir Ren Yu, son of my blood, raised in silence for his safety, now ready to step into the light." The hall exploded. Some shouted in anger, others whispered in shock. One minister stormed forward. "Lies! This is a trick. A servant boy cannot be emperor." But then a voice rang out from the back. "I am no longer a boy," Ren Yu said, stepping into the hall, dressed in white robes. His voice was calm, steady, not loud, but powerful enough to quiet the room. Shen De watched as ministers slowly bowed, some in hesitation, others in respect. And in that moment, under the painted dragons and golden tiles, a janitor
who once swept floors had changed the future of an empire. The end of silence, the start of a legacy. Days later, the emperor passed away peacefully. Ren Yu lit the incense himself, wearing the robes of mourning. Shen Dek stood quietly in the shadows, as always, holding nothing but a broom. After the ceremony, the young emperor, no longer a hidden prince, approached him. "You served my father well," he said, "and you protected the truth when it mattered." Shen Dek bowed. It was an honor. The emperor placed a hand on his shoulder. "You swept the dust from the palace and from history." A month later, a new bronze plaque was placed outside the Hall of Supreme Harmony. It read, "In honor of Shen Dek, the janitor who kept the palace clean and the throne just."